So welcome our presentations. And all right, why aren't my screens? Uh-oh, there we go. Cindy, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. My name is Cindy Walter. I'm a managing director here at Sikich. I've been in the business for about 40 years now. I always like to say that I'm a business person who happens to specialize in HR and spend full time trying to help organizations get to a successful finish on any of their plans and projects.
Great. And I'm Steve Dawson. I'm also a managing director with Sikich. I've been in the system implementation world, let's just say north of 25 years. So I've been on more projects than I can count, and worn just about every hat that you can wear on a project. So I think collectively, Cindy and I had sort of a great wealth of experience around project implementations that we were able to sort of bring into this presentation and hopefully kind of distill for the audience. So again, really look forward to sharing our thoughts with you today. Okay, so let's just talk about our agenda high level. So we're going to talk a lot about successful projects. And we're going to do that by comparing and contrasting what a successful project looks like from what an unsuccessful project looks like. And there are definitely distinct traits that that differentiate them. And so we thought it would be useful to actually try to spend a fairly equal amount of time talking about both the definition of success as well as, frankly, the opposite and what does failure look like. We're going to talk a little bit about the considerations when you're implementing a cloud solution, particularly if you're implementing a cloud solution for the first time and you're making that initial transition from, say, an on-premise solution to a cloud solution. We have found that there are some sort of unique lessons learned, shall we say, that our clients have experienced, and so we wanted to kind of share some of what we've learned with you today around the cloud space. And then finally, we are going to focus on 6 critical elements that, in our experience, really help to determine the success or the failure of a project. And so we'll outline what those 6 critical elements are, and then we'll talk about each of them in a bit more detail. So without further ado, let's dig in. Okay, so let's start by talking about success, right? So what we wanted to kind of share is what are some of the characteristics of successful projects. And again, hopefully these things will resonate with you. So first thing that we wanted to highlight, and if you've been to any of our prior presentations, you'll know that we're really big fans of building a business case as a way to prepare for an implementation. And so we're making an assumption that you've gone through that process, you've built a business case, and that business case needs to be the foundation of the implementation that you're about to undertake. And so it's really, really important that there be very strong alignment between your business case and then the ultimate project implementation. So that's certainly one of the definitions of success. I think another attribute of success is that the solution isn't something that gets outgrown quickly. So at a bare minimum, right, your organization should still find your solution to be a good fit 5 years down the road. And I would argue in many cases, for larger implementations, 5 years isn't nearly long enough, right? But maybe on some smaller implementations, 5 years would be considered reasonable, but probably anything less than 5 years, if you've outgrown your solution after, say, 3 years, then it's questionable whether you would consider that a successful project. For any of you that have had any kind of formal project management training, sort of the next bullet will be very familiar, right? That you're delivering something, and let's say you're roughly, on time, on budget, on scope, right? With, say, some very minor deviations. But that's certainly one of the definitions of success. I think it's important that you've delivered a solution that can change. So that's probably very, very closely aligned to that second bullet about putting in a solution that can live on in your organization for at least 5+ years. Well, in order to do that, it's got to be a solution that's able to adapt to changing circumstances. And so that's certainly, I think, an important attribute of success. Your technology and your processes really need to be cohesive and compatible. So that's important. I think the relationship between the customer and the vendors that customer is partnering with, you need to have really healthy and collaborative relationships. Right? When we see successful projects, we see very healthy relationships, right, between all parties, right? So that's usually an important sign. In this day and age, metrics and analytics are really, really important. So successful projects deliver more actionable information to decision makers than they had before the project, right? That is typically an expectation these days in any implementation, is that I have more information at my fingertips now than I did before. And so I think that's important. So that's certainly just some of the key things that we think really differentiate successful projects from projects that are less successful. So now let's talk about, so what are some of the behaviors and actions that lead to success? So as we kind of reflected on this, this is sort of what we came up with. And again, you'll see we're back to the business case. It's about taking that business case and really, really thinking about building a plan around the business case, right? So the business case kind of becomes the foundation for the implementation project, right? We see that in most of our really successful projects. It's understanding the vendors that you're partnering with and the solution that you've chosen. So a couple points about each of those. And in terms of the solution, it's understanding that what you probably heard from the vendor, what you think you bought, is probably not as perfect in reality as what the company would lead you to believe and what the sales team would lead you to believe. There are going to be gaps in this solution, and you need to have that expectation. You need to find those gaps as quickly as possible so you can close the gaps. But if you're going into this believing that what you've picked is a perfect solution and there's no gaps, that's probably not realistic. And so being on the lookout for those gaps is really important. I think on the vendor side, it's just understanding that in any vendor relationship, there will be conflicts of interest. There will be times when your vendor's incentives differ from your own incentives. And it's just important to recognize that and be on the lookout for that. That's really, really critical. And I think the last thing that we would really note is that successful projects all tend to have a strong, strong focus on change management. And the way that we see that play out is that change management is a core work stream in a project. It's not just a set of activities, it's a formalized work stream, and it starts on day one. It doesn't start, much later in the project. It starts day one, and it's very, very formalized and well-resourced. So those are all actionable things that you can do to increase your odds of success. And now let's kind of flip it and say, all right, so what does a failed project look like? And I suspect many of you will probably recognize some of these things in projects that you might have seen or even been a part of in your past, right? So first one out of the gate, delivering something that was not aligned to the business case, right? So your business case outlines certain needs and expectations. And if you deliver something that falls short of those needs and expectations, well, right, that could be considered a failure. If your organization outgrows the solution before, say, 5 or 10 years, again, that could be considered a failure. And one thing I'll note about that is, and I've certainly seen this in my career, that some projects at go live are celebrated as wild successes and everybody feels great. And then 2 years later, you realize that you've had a tremendous amount of rework, and that ultimately what you delivered fell short of expectations and required tremendous amounts of rework, and then perhaps even the organization decides we've outgrown this thing and it's not a good fit and we need to start all over and do something else. And the whole point of that being that sometimes you can't really distinguish success or failure at the point of go live. Sometimes that actually takes even a couple of years later to be able to look back and really know for certain, did we succeed or did we not? So yeah, sometimes it's too early to tell at go live. Obviously if you miss, if you have significant deviations on budget, on time, on functionality, right? That's clearly not a success. If you've got a demoralized project team, right? Right, that's very unfortunate. When you've got contention, right, between vendors and the customer, right, when that relationship is not healthy and collegial, right, that's a problem, and that's typically a sign that something's gone very wrong. Also, if you've had to start over, right, so if you've had to regroup and kind of start the project over, that's typically a huge red flag. If you haven't adapted your processes to fit with your new technology, that's a big red flag. If you've just lifted and shifted your old processes and think you're just going to throw in a new technology, that is rarely successful. If you haven't delivered, actionable on-demand metrics and analytics, right, that's a red flag. And then this last one, I think doesn't really get enough attention, which is you go live, right? Maybe it's on time, on budget, but the organization is not ready for the solution. So maybe the end users aren't ready, maybe the the internal support team's not ready, but if the organization's not ready at the time that you're ready with project delivery, the organization is really not ready to take advantage of the solution. Again, that could be problematic. Okay, so that's in our experience some of the signs that things haven't gone so well. So if we stop and think about, so what causes projects to fail? We could probably do a whole separate webinar just on that topic. But sort of top of mind today, we just wanted to list some of the things that we've seen. So change management is a big one. So when you wait too long to start change management, so you think of change management as just a small set of activities, and it doesn't start until, say, after testing. So it's way further down in the project timeline, and that's when you're thinking you'll ramp up some of your change activities. That's usually a really, really big mistake, and can lead to some very bad outcomes. Again, if you're completely disconnected from the business case, so if you've prepared your business case and then it goes and it sits on a shelf, and it's not really driving your project implementation and you're not aligning back to that business case, again, that often leads to bad outcomes. What you'll end up delivering may be very different than what was expected. Not having the right level of leadership on a project, not having formal planning, so winging it, right? Unfortunately, I've seen that a lot in my career, is project planning is really just kind of winging it day by day. When a project is, particularly on an implementation project, it's usually a big red flag, and I see this a lot in projects that are kind of largely driven out of the IT side of the house, is they're viewed as just technical projects, and they're disconnected from the business processes that they're supporting and that they're enabling. And there isn't that partnership between the business and the technology, and it becomes very technology centric, and the business process kind of gets lost in the shuffle. You know, that can very, very easily lead a project to fail. Not having the right resources, right? That can be time, that can be money, that can be people, that can be all of the above, right? But if you don't have the right resources, very, very hard to be successful. When you're over-reliant on your vendors, that can be problematic. And then this last thing we wanted to note is inadequate risk management. So we don't feel like risk management gets enough attention on most projects. And so we actually wanted to kind of dive into that a little further and just talk about risk for a second. So every project carries risk. You know, risk is often, what we've observed is risk is often kind of a dirty word. And unfortunately, some organizations just want to pretend that it doesn't exist. And I think they hope that they can wish it away. And our point of view is very different. Our point of view is, no, every project needs to acknowledge that there's risk, that it's healthy to acknowledge that there's risk. And it's all about mitigation. So what are some of the things you can do to mitigate risk, right? Well, you can draft strong, strong sponsors, right? Have strong executive presence in your project, right? That's definitely a risk mitigating measure. It's, as much as you can, staff your project with an A team. That will do wonders to help mitigate risk. Have a budget that has some contingency, right? So you have some flexibility for the unknowns and things that weren't expected, right? That's really important. Again, back to change. Don't wait to start change until you're deep into the project, right? Start that engagement with your stakeholders and your end user community on day one. That's huge, huge for risk mitigation. Manage your vendor. Make sure that you're managing them and they're not managing you. And then this last point, pretty simple but really effective, which is have weekly meetings where you actually talk about risk. So formalize the process of managing risk by actually having a forum that is focused around risk management. Very simple thing that you can do, and this is best done by an experienced project manager. This is one of the values. So you'll hear throughout this presentation, we're going to really push for having experienced project managers on your implementation projects. And one of the things that an experienced project manager hopefully does well is lead these risk meetings, right? And maintain a risk log and really kind of facilitate that process. The last point that we wanted to kind of call out here is it's really important, in order for risk management to be done well, you have to be open and honest and transparent and not afraid to have difficult conversations. So that's what we mean by avoid happy talk. You can't wish away risk, and by avoiding difficult conversations, it doesn't make the risk go away. So it's very, very important to create an environment where people can express concerns and observations without fear of repercussions, and that can then be, constructively feed into the risk process. Okay, so a few words on cloud, just for those of you that may not have yet experienced transitioning from sort of a legacy environment to the cloud. We wanted to kind of give you some of our insights on that. So some of the things that you will experience, right, if you haven't already. So some of the most immediate things. So this slide kind of focuses on some of the most immediate things. So the first point is about the kind of the licensing model. That you're going to notice right away that the way the software is licensed is different, and the end result of that may be that you start paying a subscription as soon as the ink hits the contract. Right? You haven't implemented the software yet, but you're paying for it, and that typically creates a lot of pressure to implement quickly. And in some cases, it can be an unhealthy amount of pressure that is not in the organization's best interests, all right? So there is such a thing as not taking enough time to implement well. And that's one of the risks that you got to manage is, are we giving ourselves enough time to do this well? And we're not just driven to cut every corner possible so we can get to the finish line as quickly as we can. So that's certainly something that we wanted to call out. Second thing that we would call out is when you're moving to SaaS, right? Typically you're moving away from an environment where you had the ability to customize, and you're moving to a solution that is configurable. And despite what you may have heard from, your vendor sales reps, these are not interchangeable, right? These are not the same thing. And I think it would be disingenuous to say that configuration is on par with customization, right? Because in my experience, it's not. That there is some loss of functionality when you move from a custom solution to a configurable solution. With the right level of creativity, you can probably find sufficient workarounds, but it's important to have the right expectations. That's part and parcel with moving to SaaS, moving to the cloud, is you're moving away from customization, and so some requirements will be more challenging to meet. But the flip side is this solution should have a lot longer lifespan than custom solutions, right? Custom solutions can be more cumbersome to maintain, and hence you will probably outgrow them sooner. So there definitely are some big advantages, but again, you have to have the right expectations. And then this last point, we just can't say enough about, on legacy platforms, we've seen clients that maybe only uptake a new release, twice in a decade. And then you move to SaaS and you'll do it twice a year, at least. Which, it's a whole different paradigm. And so release management just takes on a whole new importance, much more so than, in kind of the pre-SaaS era. So, those are things that we think right out of the gate are going to hit you. And if we delve into this, right, over time, I think what our clients would say is that the learning curve for their teams is really steep moving into this new SaaS platform, that the amount of training that their teams needed was very significant. That release management, in many cases, we've seen customers completely restructure their teams because they've realized that, wow, like I need a release manager. I never needed that before. But in the SaaS world, I actually need someone to manage releases. We're doing them so frequently, and they're so kind of part and parcel of what we're doing that I need someone to just focus on managing that day in and day out. So, you go back to the drawing board and reorganize your team. You're reskilling your team. The other thing I'd point out is you find that your teams have to become more creative problem solvers, typically in the SaaS world. So they don't have that customization lever that they can always fall back on. And consulting skills become really important for these internal teams. Whereas in the past, they may have been more order takers. In the cloud world, they will find that they need to be more consultative, and that may not be a muscle that has been flexed as much in the past. So this is some of the feedback that we get from our clients after they've kind of settled into the cloud world and they look back on that transition. And these are some of the thoughts that they've shared with us. And Cindy, I think that takes us to our first poll question.
It does. So everyone, you'll see a poll question on your screen. If you can just take a minute and answer. Anecdotally, more projects fail than are successful. How often have you seen projects go poorly? So we'll give everyone a minute or two to answer that and then share the results with you. All right, so unfortunately, someone feels like always. So we got a 2% on
Oh,
always. We got a 61% on often, which is consistent with what we hear and what we experience. Rarely 37%, never 0. So Steve, you're right on target when you said that, more often than not, projects fail rather than are successful.
Yeah,
So hopefully the information we're giving you today is going to help to avoid those failures.
absolutely. All right. Whoops. Oh boy. Sorry about that. Okay. So now we're going to get into the 6 elements that drive success or failure. So I referenced this earlier in the agenda. So, we've spent a lot of time thinking about, what are really those kind of key dimensions of projects that will ultimately either be sort of a headwind or a tailwind. And these are the 6 we came up with. So I think the first one I would probably think of as sort of project oversight, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to talk about project management, which we've referenced. Budget, very important. Resources, solution blueprint, and then change management. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of these sequentially and sort of talk about how these contribute to either success or failure. So we're going to start with the sort of project oversight area. So first, we're going to talk about the executive sponsor. So successful projects almost always have an executive sponsor. I can't really think of any that I've seen that didn't. It's very easy to call. I mean, anybody technically can be a sponsor. And so just because you give someone the title of sponsor doesn't mean that they're actually able to fulfill the responsibilities of a sponsor. So what's kind of like the ideal profile of an executive sponsor? Well, first of all, so it's someone that's a business leader. So we're talking about your CFO versus your payroll manager, right? That's what we mean when we say an executive sponsor, someone who's really in a very senior role in the organization. But that, so that's necessary, I would say, but not sufficient, right? So it's also really important that they be really enthusiastic, passionate, and engaged in the project, right? That's what you're looking for. It's someone who's a vocal champion. They're a cheerleader. They're also holding the project accountable. Kind of pushing the team in a healthy way, and when necessary, removing blockers, right? That's what a really successful executive sponsor looks like. All right, and then that the executive sponsor is sort of a key part of project governance, and really, again, I can't think of any successful project I've seen that didn't have sort of a formal governance structure. Governance is really important because this is what provides checks and balances for your project. This is ultimately how you hold your project accountable, and it can be sort of your early warning system if things are starting to veer off track, right? And you're starting to fall behind on time and over on budget. Hopefully, right, if you have strong governance, you start to see that unfolding and you have time to react to it. So, your sponsor is certainly one of those key members of the governance team. And it's important that governance be a formal process, right? There's recurring meetings, standing agendas, right? This isn't something that happens ad hoc. It's something that's very formalized. And the best governance teams we've seen, aren't just looking at time, budget, scope, but they're also looking at the readiness of the organization to accept the project delivery. So, is our organizational readiness keeping pace with the project delivery, right? That's ideally what's happening, at the governance level. Okay, and then if we think about what does a, kind of poor poor fit sponsor look like? Where am I more likely to, to fail? Well, obviously if you've got someone that's not at the right level in the organization, and then that can be challenging. And then secondly, right, someone who's they're not that interested, they're not passionate, they're not engaged, they're basically a figurehead, but they don't really want to be involved. They're not very interested. And sadly we've seen a lot of those. So they're a sponsor in name only, but they're not really contributing in any meaningful way to the project. That's where your sponsor is probably more of a headwind than a tailwind, sadly. Okay, and now we'll shift gears to our second element, which is project management. So what is successful projects that are successful? What does a project management function look like? Well, it's typically staffed by someone who's very experienced in project management. They're likely a project management professional, right? This is what they do for a living, is they manage complex projects, right? They know the difference between a project plan on a piece of paper and delivering a successful project in reality, right? That those aren't necessarily the same thing. Hopefully the project manager has a job description, so everybody understands and has the same expectations of what is that role, what's expected of them. They have a blend of management and leadership skills. They have really good interpersonal skills and are really attuned to team dynamics. It's ideal if they have some domain knowledge. So for example, if you're putting in an HR system, it's ideal if they have at least some amount of domain knowledge and human resources, at least know some key processes and some key terms. And they've got a lot of experience working with third parties, and they understand some of the nuances of working with third parties. They're able to differentiate between the value that a project is expected to provide, right, which stems from the business case, and just managing to a plan, and that they can see the difference between what's the value that I'm ultimately accountable for delivering versus just the set of tasks that we've created in our plan. And they're flexible, right? They're able to adapt as the situation on the ground is changing. That's really, really important. And then we just wanted to outline, because this role is so versatile and there's such a range of skills that you need, we just wanted to outline some of the skills that are really critical to being a project manager. And again, the point being that these people can be hard to find, because it's a very difficult job to do well, but it can absolutely make the difference between success or failure, no doubt. And then kind of goes without saying, if we want to kind of look at the flip side of, hey, when is your project manager potentially more of a liability than an asset? Well, if you've got someone who doesn't really have any experience in this area, they haven't really managed projects before, and maybe the primary reason that you picked them is because they're the only one that was available, and their style is to be more of a taskmaster. They're just managing the plan, and they're very rigid, and they're just going to stick to the plan no matter how things change on the ground. They're just sticking to the plan, and they're uncomfortable having difficult conversations, and they try to tune out anything that's problematic or unpleasant, and just pretend that it didn't exist and just kind of focus on the plan. If that sounds like your project manager, then that's a red flag. And with that, Cindy, I think I am passing the baton to you.
Thank you, Steve. So let's keep going. Steve has already identified a number of themes: change management, leadership, a number of areas that I'm going to follow up on as I go through the next several slides. Vendor management is a very different skill than managing employees, colleagues, internal resources. You don't have the same relationship. The balance of power, quite honestly, is different. You often assume that the vendor knows more about their product than you do, which is true, but the balance to that is you know more about your organization, and you need a fit that balances both the product and your organization. As Steve mentioned, sometimes there is a conflict between the vendor's goals. Their goals may be time focused so that they can get the implementation done, get on to the next one. Your goals might be quality focused, and you might have a lot of diversity in your organization and your processes that you need to pay attention to and deliver on. So managing the vendor is a critical part of project management, and it takes some experience and some maturity to be effective at it. It does take some very specific skills, and Steve mentioned some of those in the last slide. So implementing any technology or any program, it doesn't matter. Is it a benefits program, a compensation program, a technology program? You don't want to just re-engineer the business. You need to understand the relationship between the vendor and what the vendor brings to the table in your organization, and that's usually tied up in your business case. Steve, if you want to keep going.
Yeah.
In many of these areas, there's a strong value to an independent voice. Number one, because of the knowledge, the skills, the experience. When we come to the table, we bring a lot of years. Steve mentioned, we've done so many projects, we probably can't count them all. It's what we do day in and day out. So there are skills that we bring. Not only do we bring them to the table, we're going to coach your team up, support your team, and help to develop those skills on your team. We know how to develop project plans. We do them day in and day out. And there are nuances to project plans. There are pieces that are easy to forget. The same as budgeting. You know, you may budget based on one piece of information that one party brought to the table, but there's a lot more in the budgeting process if you want to be successful. And another important feature that we look to, that we formalize with templates and discussion, is the assessment for go live readiness. Not just because you hit a timeline, just because you hit a scope, it doesn't mean that you're ready to implement. And change management is also going to play into that one. Have you started your change management early enough in the process? So we'll talk through that in just a minute. Steve, if you want to keep going. We've got a poll question now. So how receptive is your organization to bad news? Because every project at some point is going to bring some bad news. So if you can just take a minute and let us know your organization's not receptive, and this tends to be a cultural thing. Your sponsors only want good news. They delay as long as possible. They don't want to hear the good news. You know, they sort of put their hands over their ears and do a la, la, la. Or they have weekly meetings and expect transparency. Three very different cultures and sets of expectations. So the answer is they aren't. 9% said your organization is not receptive to bad news. 21%, they delay as long as possible. And the good news is that 70% have weekly meetings and expect transparency.
Wow.
That's the strongest option, and it will move to success rather than failure. Let's talk about the budgeting process. Phone a friend, find a friend, develop a friendship with somebody in your finance organization, one of your financial analysts who will sit with you, who has done project work before, who understands the details of project work. The budget is a detailed process, and it's a detailed process because there are pieces like, are employees going to be assigned to the project full time, and will there be backfills? There's a budget implication for that. And have you built that in? How do you build that in? What if your implementation is going to take longer than a year? How do you roll in software purchases, resource requirements, celebrations into a multi-year budget? And by the way, how much contingency have you put into your budget for unexpected issues that arise along the way? You know, organizations have funding standards and funding guidelines, and having a support person within your finance organization will help you to stay within those guidelines and will help you to ensure that you're able to deliver your project on budget. And by the way, go live is just the beginning. It's not the end of the budgeting process, because there's ongoing costs to maintain, to expand, to train, etc. And on the other side, Steve, if you want to go to the next slide,
Sure.
It's easy to fail on the budget side of the house. It's easy to miss a budget. So the easiest way to miss your budget is to just go lock yourself in a room and build your budget because somebody told you in whatever role you're in, that's your job, and not ask other people for input, not understand the organizational guidelines or approach, not have a partner on the finance side of the house. It's easy to miss resource funding. It's easy to expect that departments are going to fund the backfill of the resources who have been assigned to the project, and therefore not consider those as part of the full cost of doing the project. The danger to that is if you've got a multi-year project and the department has not budgeted for multiple years, you could end up losing a resource that gets called back into the department because there's no more backfill. So make sure that you're understanding all of the pieces, make sure that you've built a contingency into your budget, and that the costs include travel, meals, celebrations. And it sounds like those might be minor items, but they're not on many projects. So there's a lot of detail in budget, and it's easy to fail. Steve, if you want to keep going. It's easy for budget creep or scope creep to come into your project. Somebody walks by, an executive comes by the project office and says, Steve, I know that you're building X for the IT organization. Well, our need isn't really X. Something just came up and we now need Y. Can you do Y for us? And the answer is always yes, but. Well, the answer is usually yes, but. Yes, but what else are we taking out so that we can maintain scope? Train your team, because a lot of teams don't understand how easy it is to say yes in the moment and how difficult it is to deliver on something that's already been planned and laid out. So you want to, Steve talked about process work a couple of times. You want to make sure that what you've built into this plan and this project is standardization, so that when somebody comes to you and says, well, I just need you to tweak this a little bit, the change management and the pushback is, we've agreed as an organization to change our current process to get to standardization, so we minimize the cost and the variation in what we're delivering in this project. And monitor that budget. Again, in those weekly meetings, monitor your budget. Steve, if you want to keep going. Resource success. It should be a privilege to be on a project, not a punishment. You need a combination of seasoned subject matter experts. You need people who have strong institutional knowledge, who understand what your organization does, why they do it, and where's the negotiation. Where is it that you're going to be able to change people's behaviors versus where the hard and fast no's in the organization. And how do you deliver that message back and forth? One of the things, if we picked 6 items here, there were probably 16 we could have talked about. And one of them is communication skills. How are we delivering messages back to the organization? So project assignments are very often growth assignments or stretch assignments, but if everybody on the team is in a growth assignment or a stretch assignment, it will fall apart on you. You need to manage those resource risks. And the other thing that often happens on a project, the longer the project, the greater the risk of turnover. Someone gets fatigued, someone gets a different job offer, an internal position opens. So you have to plan for that and understand that project managers really are delivering success through their team, not on their own. On the other side of that, resource failure, Steve. Your project manager is not listening to the messages from the team. That doesn't mean what's said in team meetings. That doesn't mean what's said even one-on-one. Your project manager needs to have that sixth sense about what's going on in the project. So through listening, observing, all of the unconscious messages as well as the straightforward messages, the project manager should be absorbing those all the time. They should be looking for opportunities to make sure that people are balanced on the team, that you've got that mix of seasoned project resources versus inexperienced resources who are on stretch assignments, and how to make sure when someone's having a bad day, you know what they need to get them through that day and get them back on the right track. Sometimes your resources lose focus. How do you keep them focused? That's going to be critical. You need to make sure that during your project, you've got internal technical SMEs who are also learning their role in supporting this project going forward, this technology, this program. And if there are issues, address them early, address them head on. Don't assume that they'll fix themselves, because they rarely do. And if people are failing just for whatever reason, it's not a judgment of an individual. It says somehow there was a mismatch between an individual and an assignment, and you need to correct that immediately. So if we can keep going. Early on in your project, after you've assembled your team, you've got your contract in place, you're going to start blueprinting. Blueprinting says, what are we going to have for processes? What are we going to have for results when we finish this? You have a choice. You can just redo what you have in place now. We call that paving the cow path. The other term we sometimes use is putting lipstick on the pig. But either one, the reason these terms come up is because they happen regularly. So Steve talked about the future's different than the past. Prepare yourselves that the future is different than the past. Talk about that. Understand when there's changes to the budget or to the scope or to the timeline, other things will shift as well. And probably the most important thing you can do here is engage a cross-functional team in this discussion so that it's not a single perspective of what we are going to get as a result of this project. Steve, we can keep going. Failure is easy to come by in blueprinting. First of all, as Steve and I have both shared, assume the vendor has your best interest at heart at all times and do whatever they suggest. That's not necessarily the right solution. The right solution is a blend between what the vendor's bringing to the table and what your organization needs. And where are you going to find that? Back in your business case. So do not let go of your business case. Strike that balance. Everything you're going to do throughout the project has to maintain a balance. Don't accept temporary solutions. When a vendor or even one of your team says, well, we don't know how to do that. So let's just do this on a temporary basis and we'll come back and figure that out. Chances are you're not going to come back around because you're going to be so engaged in other work. And minimize how often you're saying, okay, if the system doesn't do, or the program doesn't do, or the process doesn't do, we'll just do a manual workaround. Manual workarounds will choke you in the long term. So to the extent possible, avoid manual workarounds. Steve? Another aspect to your blueprint is how are you going to phase this project? Are you going to put it all in place, big bang, January 1st, everything happens, we've got a whole new world magic wand? Or are you going to allow phasing that says we'll do the first piece? So we'll do the demographic piece first. We'll roll that out, get a reaction. We'll have some opportunity for proof of concept. And it's going to depend on your organization, your project, and all the rest of the elements of your business case. So monitor your timeline, whether you're doing big bang or phased, keep an eye on that timeline. And as you're approaching a deliverable or a milestone, if they're slipping, what are you going to do to adjust? Don't allow everything to slip. Make sure that you're coming back and making adjustments. And again, if you come into staffing shortages, understand what that impact is on your timeline and your budget. Steve? Can we keep going?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
It's not advancing.
Ah.
Well, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, now it's happy.
And the next big one, which is really the last big element of the 6 that Steve outlined, is change management. So change management says preparing the organization. It's communication. It's discussions with executives across the organization, with staff meetings. Invite yourself to staff meetings and tell them about your project. It's generating the excitement. All of those things are part of change management, and you want to start that early. You want to make sure that your executive sponsors are your cheerleaders and that they have organizational gravitas and they're sharing with their own organizations and across the organization the value and the importance of this. Do a stakeholder analysis, which is a critical early step for change management. That says go through a formal process, and we build templates for this to identify who's impacted, how are they impacted, who are your resistors in your organization, and who are your supporters. Training is only a small piece. Training is the part that you can prepare at the end of the project to roll out as part of Go Live. But it's only a piece of change management. It's not all of change management. And you want to develop modularized documentation and training that you can, number one, update as functionality changes, and number two, to continue to roll out to employees, new hires, transfers, etc. Identify a tiered support model for Go Live so that if you're going to get a lot of questions, if you're anticipating questions, if you're anticipating the need for technical support, you've got a model in place that you can respond quickly, effectively, and positively. So let's see if we can get the slide. Thank you, Steve. The other side of that, the flip side, is how do you fail at change management? Assume the solution is going to be better. So you don't have to worry about talking about it, preparing. It's just going to be better. Everybody's going to love it. Wait too long. Assume only the people who are direct users are impacted and are stakeholders, and don't worry about anybody else, because then you're going to find out everybody else who you didn't anticipate was a stakeholder is a stakeholder. They're going to be knocking on your door. How you provide training, the mix of training is going to be important to success, and it will also lead to failure. If all you do is self-paced training, chances are you're not going to get great support depending on your organization. Make sure you're continuing to engage your executive team. All right. So let's do a quick poll question. What's your organization's approach to change management? Your organization doesn't understand why we should even do it. We don't have internal change management resources. We treat training like it is change management, or we have a robust change management team. Okay. Little understanding, good. So most organizations understand it. You may not have internal change management resources. The good news is that there are a lot of third-party resources. We do a lot of change management for our clients. We treat training like it is change management. That's tough. If you're doing that and you want to have a conversation with us, we can help you with that. And it's great to see that 24% of you have a robust change management team. All right, we're getting close to the end of time, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. There are the 6 elements that Steve talked about. Executive sponsorship, so you want organizational gravitas in that role. Program leadership and project management. Your project manager will deliver success through the team. They need a lot of very senior skills to be successful in that role. Budget, phone a friend. Find somebody in finance to work with you on a comprehensive budget. Resources, you want a balance of seasoned resources and stretch resources. Make sure you have resources who understand your institutional requirements and can blend those with vendor options. Blueprint, take the time to engage your organization in discussion about what you're looking for at the end of the project. And remember to continue to refine and monitor your business case that you started out with. And finally, change management, change management, change management, start to finish. Okay, so with successful projects, they deliver on the commitments in the business case. They have broad organizational support, broad adoption, and they leverage the technical and functional features of the product or the service. And projects that are failures, they miss the advantages of the new platform. They added costs. They don't recognize or address difficult issues as they are happening. They let those linger. They don't make the changes that are offered, and they allow the vendors to make decisions and steer the ship. And they missed on change management. So that's our experience. I know we're very close to wrap up, so I'm going to hand it back to Steve to do a couple of follow-up items.
Yeah, just thank you, Cindy. Just a couple of housekeeping things. So at the end of this presentation, there will be a survey. We'd really love your feedback, so we encourage you to complete those surveys. We got a lot of great questions from folks. We will follow up after the presentation on those questions. And then we've been recording today. We will also be following up with the recording of this presentation, and we encourage you to share that with colleagues. And lastly, again, thank you for your time. Appreciate you spending an hour with us, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Cindy.